All right, as you can see, we're going to continue with the time period 1750 to 1900, often referred to as the long 19th century. What we've talked about so far, back in chapters 23 and 24, we talked about Europe, industrialization, the revolutions that went on in Europe. We talked about the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, the American Revolution, revolution in economics with capitalism and the new socialism, kind of designed by Karl Marx. We talked about imperialism, how Europe now has the motivation, the market, the need to sell goods, the need for markets, and the need for raw materials to go around the world trying to collect those and sell their finished products. And the fact that they've got supreme militaries allows them to go into imperialism. We talked about how that impacted different parts of the world. Then in chapter 25, we looked at Latin America. We talked about how Latin America moved from colonies at the beginning of this time period to independent states and what that looked like. We talked about how it didn't really change that much for the average person. If you were a slave before the independence movements, you were still a slave afterwards. But they did get rid of their European rulers, and they did head towards republics, with the exception of Brazil. And those republics were dominated by the wealthy landowning class. Okay, so now we're going to switch parts of the world, and we're going to look at the Ottomans and the Islamic heartland, that having to do with around the Mediterranean. And we're going to look at Qing China, the last dynasty of China. Okay, so why did the Ottoman Empire appear weak at the beginning of the mid-18th century? In other words, around 1750, why does the Ottoman Empire appear to be weak? Now, please understand, the Ottoman Empire by 1750 has already been around a long time. It's been around about 450 years, so it is a very long-lasting empire. But in 1750 and through the early 1800s, the Ottoman Empire is in decline. In fact, it gets the nickname the sick man of Europe. So why? Okay, number one, they're faced with outside enemies. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, or Austrian Habsburg Empire, is getting stronger, and they're able to push back. Remember, at the peak, the Ottomans had driven all the way to Vienna, which sits in Austria. So they had made pretty darn good progress into Central Europe. Also, Russia's getting stronger. And at this time, Russia's starting to push towards the Black Sea. Russia has always wanted a warm weather port. Under Peter the Great, they got St. Petersburg, but that's up on the Baltic Ocean, or Baltic Sea, rather, sorry. The Baltic Sea, which freezes during the winter. They wanted a warm weather port. And in order to do that, they had to take land on the Black Sea. And who controlled land around the Black Sea? That's right, the Ottomans. So it's bringing them in direct conflict with the Ottomans. Plus, the Ottomans, if you remember, at their peak, had ruled all the way to Spain. So they're going to lose their North African colonies or areas. They're going to break away. So the Ottomans are weakening. They also are facing some economic problems. They've got rising inflation. Europe is industrializing. They've also, back during the commercial revolution, had started the cottage industries. They're expanding and they're competing against Ottoman companies and Ottoman products. There are social problems. There's crime, rebellion, weakening leaders. Some of these sultans are not what their ancestors were. They're not versed in the military. They've been hidden away. They're weak. And the military of the Europeans is getting stronger, and they're really finding it hard to hold the Europeans back. So what problems rose due to a collection of weak rulers? Number one, because there's nobody really in charge, you've got conflict between the government ministers, religious experts, and the Janissaries. Now, if you'll remember back, the Janissaries were those slave soldiers, usually taken from Christian families who are raised to be Muslims or raised to be loyal to the Ottoman Empire. And they will really be a difficult thing for the sultans to overcome. Local leaders and landlords cheat the Ottoman Empire out of money. The way the Ottomans raise taxes is the Ottoman state itself did not collect the taxes. What they do is they give that to local leaders and local lords to do, and then they were supposed to pass it on up. Well, you can guess, if you've got weak guys at the top, what are these guys down here starting to do with some of that tax money? It's right. They're starting to keep it for themselves. So we've got problems there. Artisans and merchants are declining. They're not keeping up with the advances the Europeans are doing, and their goods are not as cheap as the Europeans. They're still making everything by hand. Now, it's beautiful what they make. It's exquisite, but it's too expensive for most people. Merchants who had survived through contacts with Europeans, the Europeans are now going around. You remember how we talked about how they sailed down the west coast of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope and into the Indian Ocean. And they're bypassing the Turks. So the Ottoman Turks, are losing tax money on goods coming through. They're losing business. It's tough for them. Okay. So it's obvious they've got to reform, right? So what do? Some of the sultans say we need to improve things. So they push for improvements in the bureaucracy, a better run government. That's always a good thing. Better navy and a better army. However, the Janissary Corps and many of the top bureaucrats feel threatened by this. And so they resist these changes. The Janissaries, if you remember, they had made their fame because they were back in charge of siege cannons. But warfare's changed since the old sieging of Constantinople, where you put these giant guns outside and blew down city walls. Now you need more light, mobile artillery because the battlefield's moving, the battlefield's transforming, and they don't want to give up their position, their power. So they fight reform. Okay. Earlier, some of these guys some sultans had been killed by the Janissaries. When the Janissaries felt threatened, they had killed them. So Mahmud II comes along, and he devises a rather ingenious plan to deal with these guys. What he decides is, quite bluntly, he's going to kill all the Janissaries. But how do you kill skilled soldiers? If they've got their weapons, they're going to be tough to handle, right? So what do? Well, you get them without their weapons. And here's what he does. He trains in secret, he trains his own army. And this army is trained to wipe out the sultans. The Sultan Mahmud makes the Janissaries feel kind of mistreated. They're not paid attention to like they should be. So he starts to shortchange them on food. And one night, they don't have enough to eat. They're angry. They march out of their barracks, go out into the street to complain and protest. And who's waiting for them? Mahmud's secret army. They close the doors to the barracks so they can't get back in and get their weapons and slaughter them all. What are some other reforms made? Well, really, we've got two competing forces within the Ottoman Empire for what kind of reforms we ought to have. Number one, religious leaders are pushing for a conservative theocracy. They want to go back to the old ways. They believe that the reason the Ottoman Empire is not doing so well now is because it's abandoned its past. And they're like, we need to go back. Others, number two, and this is the option the Mahmud chain chooses, is to copy the Western reforms. He says, okay, the Western countries, France and England, have great armies. England has a great navy. They're successful. Maybe what we need to do is not go back to the old ways, but to copy the Western Europe. And that's the route he chooses. So he's going to create ambassadors to Europe. He's going to try to westernize his military. And he's not the only one who's going to try to reform things within the Ottoman Empire. One of the other things that happens is along comes a group called the Ottoman Society for Union and Progress. We know them better as the Young Turks. The Young Turks start in the late 1800s, and they kind of want to work with the Sultan, but their reforms, the Sultans don't move fast enough. So in 1908, they're actually going to assassinate a Sultan and become the real power themselves. They'll put another guy in charge, but he's kind of a figurehead and all that because they feel like the sultans just aren't moving quickly enough. So they start to move quickly. But look at that year, 1908. That's just 6 years before what? 1914? That's right, World War I. And they try to institute reforms. They try to reform the government. They try to reform the military. And one of the things they do is they say, we're going to go back into the Balkans, that area of Greece and the countries north of it, Yugoslavia, Serbia, Montenegro, that part of the world. And we're going to reassert ourselves and we're going to take back those European lands that we used to own. But we know 1914 means World War I. And which side did the Ottomans choose to join? The Germans. Why the Germans? Well, understand that the British had been busy, even though the Ottomans were kind of their enemy, had been for hundreds of years. During the 1800s, they're actually trying to help the Ottoman Empire survive, prop it up. Why? You might ask, why? If they've been your enemy for centuries, why would you prop them back up? Well, they're afraid if the Ottomans fall apart, that Russia's going to come down into this part of the world and become the great power. And then they'll have to deal with a powerful Russia, and they don't want that. So when the Young Turks want to get rid of the Sultan, they don't turn to the British, but they turn to which country's military advisors? Yep, Germany. And so when World War I breaks out, they're on the German side. But we know what's going to happen to the Germans, right? They're going to lose World War I. And by extension, the Ottomans do too. We'll talk about that more later on. It's going to divide the Ottomans up. And the Arabs push back against the Ottomans. Now, the Ottomans and the Arabs are two different ethnic groups, right? The Ottomans are Turks. They speak a Turkish language, which comes more out of Central Asia. And the Arabs speak a Semitic language, Arabic, just like Hebrew is a Semitic language. Okay? So they're not going to like each other. And one of the things that Arabs had hoped is that when the Young Turks ascended to power, that they would grant some freedoms to them, to the Arabs. Do the Turks do that? No, they double down. They double down and they really become oppressive on the Arabs. So they're trying to fight in the Balkans. Then they try to fight the British in World War I. And they're also fighting internal fights because the Arabs are rising up against their rule and doesn't work very well. Okay. Also, during this time, I mentioned earlier that Europe's becoming more powerful. And one of the things that happens is Western European countries make intrusions into this part of the world. For example, Napoleon invades Egypt in the late 1790s. He ends up having to leave Egypt, but it's not because of what the Ottomans or the Egyptians or the Mamluks have done to him. It's because the British, with their navy, have come into the Mediterranean and cut off supplies. So he's got to try to avoid the British and get around and get back to France. So again, what are three ways of revising this decline in the Islamic world? And the options they look at are return to the past, adopt Western ways, or combine the two. Now, earlier, Mahmud had tried to go Western. Muhammad Ali, who's in charge of Egypt now, Egypt is kind of semi-independent, autonomous. The Ottoman Turks don't really tell them what to do, although the Ottomans claim it part of their empire. The British are going to be somewhat in charge, And the Egyptians kind of consider themselves independent. It's kind of a mess. But Muhammad Ali, who will be in charge of Egypt, he decides to try to institute reforms. He's going to try to bring back the Islamic ways and adopt Western ideas. And one of the things that he really gets enamored with is this whole Industrial Revolution and the European style military. So, what does he do when he tries to copy the European style military? Number one, he brings in French officers. The French have, at this time, the best army in Europe or maybe the world. England, Great Britain has the best navy, but the best army relies with the French. They're going to do conscription. That means to force. If you conscript somebody, you force them to do something. They're going to conscript peasants in this part of the world, in Egypt. They're also going to adopt Western styles of supply, Western military tactics, and really they do build a very successful fighting force in the Middle East. The other thing they're really interested in is the Industrial Revolution. Number three, they don't totally transform the economy. What they hope to do is to build a big industries, particularly in clothing, because they're growing lots of cotton, and really are helped by the U.S. Civil War because England's buying much of its cotton from the American South. But when the American South gets cut off by the American Civil War, they turn to India and Egypt really responds. They're hoping that this industrialization will allow them to pay for this big military. It doesn't quite work that way. They want the peasants to produce more cotton and more food off the same amount of land with the same technology. They basically, as I've got there, they tell the peasants, increase production. Peasants are like, without more land, without better machines, better seeds, we're doing the best we can. They do build some new harbors and canals and irrigation, but they cannot match the European industry because the Europeans make things cheaper. And so what happens is Egypt becomes a cotton exporting country. Remember, he wanted to copy the military and industrialization. It's more successful with the military, not so successful with industrialization. And cotton becomes pretty much the staple export crop. It's their moneymaker, which when times are good is a great thing. When times are bad and you're dependent upon one crop, you're not diversified, you're in trouble. So they kind of ebb and flow, boom and bust. And the wealthy, when times are good, they have a tendency to spend their money extravagantly. They waste it. Then when times are bad, they got to borrow. From whom does Egypt borrow? England. Well, that creates its own problems. Egypt goes into debt to European financiers, particularly the British. Remember some of those canals that were being built? Well, one of them that was built with European support was the Suez Canal. And you can see I've got a couple of maps there. Suez Canal showing how it connects from the Mediterranean down to the Red Sea. This was a great shortcut. You got your military quicker to India. You got your goods quicker. It was cheaper, making more money. So the British in particular, but the British and the French and Europeans in general liked the Suez Canal. And they want to control it. When Egypt can't repay its debts, Britain says, okay, we'll take stock in the Suez Canal. Give us some ownership of the Suez Canal. Then when there are problems in Egypt and the Egyptian rulers can't handle it, they call on the British army to help them put down a rebellion. British step in, very imperialistic. They've already got some land. They step in to help them during a military fight, and they ask for more power. And Egypt becomes kind of I don't want to overstate it, becomes kind of a puppet state of England. They set up Khedives. The British felt justified because they had helped them out with the revolt in the 1880s. And it really begins British direct rule, although the Ottomans claim it too, of Egypt. That's going to come back during World War One. Okay. Um, so that kind of takes us up to the Qing. We finished off with the Ottomans and what's going on in the Islamic heartland. Please understand that you should be taking notes. Remember, we're going to turn those in. And on part 2 lecture, we'll jump in and talk about what's going on with the Qing. Thanks. Talk to you guys soon.